New Mexico CD3 Representative Ben Ray Lujan and challenger Jefferson Byrd faced off in the studios of KENW in Portales. New Mexico PBS aired the debate last night, and if you missed it, you can watch it on our YouTube channel. Now, here to offer insights on this and other issues of the week is line regular attorney Laura Sanchez-Rivey. We're also welcoming back, after a long time away, Stephanie Mays, CEO of the Center for Civic Policy. Welcome back. Today we have two newcomers on the line. First, Merritt Allen, owner and executive director of Vox Optima LLC, a public relations company, and Carla Sontag, president and founder of the New Mexico Business Coalition. Welcome, everybody. Now, Laura, many say Mr. Ben Ray Lujan, the incumbent, does not have a tough slog ahead of him. This is the second time around against Mr. Byrd. But was something different in the debate you watched versus how they went at each other the first time around? Did something kind of strike you differently this time around?
You know, I thought that there was a lot of difference in terms of the preparation that was involved. I mean, certainly Ben Ray came across to me, the congressman, I should say, came across as very, well prepared, knowledgeable about the district, very much with specifics. What I heard from Jeff Byrd was a lot of the, what I've heard before, really, and I think what to a certain extent appeals to some of the far right in that district. I mean, we're talking about San Juan, San Juan County and that area, which tends to be oil and gas, and he certainly, I think, talked about some of those specifics, and he's got a background, obviously, in oil and gas. And so I think that he definitely spoke to that base, but they were also together on some issues, which was surprising. There was some immigration issues that they seemed to agree on to a certain extent. There were some things that I think I was surprised by how much closer they seemed to be on certain issues.
Yeah. Did you have a sense, Carla, as well? Because I think I'm with Laura on that. The last time they ran against each other, they were much further apart philosophically. There were a couple of issues that got them closer. Not together,
Absolutely.
but closer.
Yes, I agree. And I was surprised that the congressman was he seemed on the attack a little bit more, because he's got a pretty comfortable lead, it seems like, in that district. But he did a very good job. He is also very knowledgeable of the issues.
Sure.
But I agree that they came together, and I like to see that, because I think compromise everywhere is going to make it better.
How did you gauge the congressman's comfort level? Did he seem more comfortable to you in times past? Is there something growing in him that you picked up on as well?
He seemed comfortable with where he's at, and maybe that's why he was a little more on the offensive. I'm not sure, but I think that he did a good job of communicating his position.
Sure, absolutely. Merritt, good to see you, and thank you for coming. Great to have you here as a first-timer. Mr. Byrd, I appreciate the tone of the debate. And of course, when you're that far behind, you have to sometimes throw bombs and really kind of get very aggressive. Was he aggressive enough to flip some votes in your view?
Well, no. I mean, if you look at that district, a Republican is not going to win in that district without getting the moderates in Los Alamos and the moderates in Santa Fe and the independent voters. And he is not speaking to them. He's speaking to the more far-right conservative voters who are going to vote for him anyway.
Sure.
So I feel like he missed an opportunity to be more moderate and reach out to that independent swing voter.
Sure. What could he have done, in your view, in that appeal to those swing voters? Were there a couple specific issues that he could have laid out there, in your view?
I actually just, in his personal introduction,
Yeah.
As soon as I saw that, I thought, oh, oil guy, and my first thought was southeastern New Mexico, and having a faith-based platform, I'm all for, but in northern New Mexico, as a Catholic, his faith-based platform didn't really jive with my view and senses. So I think I don't think he got to any of the base northern New Mexico Democrat voters. I think he made his base Republican voters happy, and I don't think he got to any moderates.
Sure.
Ben Ray, or Congressman Lujan, the more you reelect someone, the stronger they get. I think he was very vulnerable, and he got a lot of criticism for being inexperienced. He's so much more polished, I thought. The New Mexico Republicans are not spending money on the national races. That shows in preparation. I think Jeff is a really good candidate and has good ideas. I wish he'd run for a state district.
I've heard others say that too. That he's got a good lineup for that, and then think about Congress later. So.
So, Dean, if I could just respond to a few things that have been said, Merritt, I completely agree with you. I think the congressman came across as extremely polished. And to respond a little bit to what Carla said, I don't necessarily think that the congressman was on the attack or necessarily even super offensive. I think he just truly has a vision and was really able to articulate that vision and actually had the policy specifics that Laura referenced to back up how he wants to achieve that vision. So I think that is a little bit different than what we've seen in previous elections.
The congressman did bring up, however, Mr. Byrd's no-show at a recent event and try to make a little something out of that. Is that not aggressive in your view? Was that
No, I mean,
fair
I think
game
it's
in your
legitimate.
view?
Yeah,
Okay.
I definitely think it's legitimate. I think, you know, the way that we interact with our communities and what the constituents expect of their, you know, delegates, it's important, and it's important to highlight that and to educate that.
Sure.
To educate, you know, voters on those issues. I also think, you know, in terms of Byrd, I think that he did outline some positions, and it's true what's been said. You know, there's some similarities in their positions on issues. I think there are some stark contrasts, and one sort of critique that I have of Byrd's positions is that I couldn't really tell if he was dodging Sam's questions or Sam, like Sam and I go way back. I don't know Sam.
That's funny.
Sam Donaldson's questions, or if he just really doesn't have firm policy positions. And what I wanted to hear was proactive policy solutions to the issues.
Yeah, you know, Laura, one of the difficulties in running these kind of debates is, you know, getting district-specific questions to sort of leave off other people, especially at the congressional level. You know, we can talk about the inactivity in Congress, we can talk about ISIS and all these other things around the world, but it really does come down to the district sometimes. And Jeff Byrd, it seems to me, has not a bad profile for the district when you think about his oil and gas stuff, considering Four Corners. You know, we've got the generating stations and things up there. There's a congressional fingerprint and all these kinds of things. Did he miss an opportunity to talk about those kind of things and insert those kind of ideas in your view?
I mean, I think certainly having the experience at Navajo Refinery and Artesia is going to
Right.
be important for understanding a lot of that stuff. But I think to me, for a lot of the same folks that Merritt mentioned, Santa Fe moderates and Los Alamos moderates, you know, to start out with, I lived in Artesia and worked at Navajo Refinery, really shows that you're coming from the southern part of the state,
Right.
which is very different from northern New Mexico. Those of us that are from southern New Mexico understand that contrast. I mean, it's a whole different world. And if you spend any time living in those areas and then living in northern New Mexico, it's very, very different. And I think he could have spoken a little bit more to some of the issues that the folks care about the most locally, some of the water issues. I think there was a water question in there.
That's right.
He could have talked about some of the acequias.
That's
I mean, there's a
right.
lot of things that are much more important to those areas. He also, what struck me, he talked about, and he sort of clumsily, in my opinion, you know, and not to slam him too much, but he sort of danced around the issue of public lands and the congressman's support for designation of national monuments, which has been huge for Taos County and certain counties in northern New Mexico with Rio Grande del Norte National Monument. And he was clearly using talking points from the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument recent designation, which is a southern New Mexico boon. You know, that's for southern New Mexico. So it was this mixing of sort of references that I don't think connected very well with the constituencies in northern New Mexico.
Carol, on another note, for business, you represent a business group. You know, business in our state, of course, is hard to chase. Sam Donaldson brought this up, speaking about him, about the economy, one of the early questions. What did you hear regarding business from these two candidates that gave you either pause or pleasure, one of the two?
Not nearly enough.
Okay.
I would have rather heard a lot more from both of them.
Okay.
And you know, I thought they did as well as they could under the circumstances. But to clarify what I was saying earlier, I think what Congressman did in almost every question, he would state what Jeff's position was and then go back to his.
Right.
And I would have rather seen just more time on what is your position and what are your thoughts.
Gotcha.
And so, not to criticize how he handled it, but that's where I was going with it. In the business realm, there is so much more that we could have heard from them both on their position on how to improve the economy.
Sure.
Gene, one thing that the congressman did reference, which I think is really interesting, and I'd be really curious about your position on it, but the cooperative research and development agreements that he's instituted through the Congress that actually is intended to spur economic development and growth and entrepreneurialism in the areas of technology. And so I think that's one example of an actual policy-specific piece that he referenced when it comes to economic development and jobs. But hearing more about that, I think from both of the candidates would have been, I think, optimal.
Sure. Merritt, to finish, sorry about that, slip you into the last bit here. As a business owner, and you're no stranger to government contracts and things like that, Los Alamos didn't come up a whole lot during this debate, unfortunately. But did you hear anything that gave you the pause or anything else from these two candidates about Los Alamos and strengthening its role here in New Mexico?
To be honest, I would echo Carla, not enough.
Yeah.
But it's almost like a dirty little secret. We're totally dependent on federal dollars and federal spending in this state, but we don't want to be. We want to grow business. And what I didn't hear as a small business owner, I heard about technology. There are a lot of businesses in New Mexico that have nothing to do with the film industry, that have nothing to do with technology, and this state. And I think federally, we tend to leave those firms behind. And I didn't hear either one of them discuss that.
I would agree. If you missed it, the full CD3 debate is online now. Go to NewMexicoInFocus.org. Now, up next, correspondent Gwyneth Dolan interviews Mike Freeze.